Listen what I say. The captain is a tyrant and I no longer obey. I'm sick of taking orders from the madman in command. So let's stop him on an island and leave him.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. We're all set.
Okay, hello and welcome to a very special episode of the History of the Atlantic World podcast. I'm Jesse Wiest, your caffeinated host. Thank you for joining us. With me today is Dr. Alida Metcalf, a professor of history at Rice University. Her areas of expertise include studying Rio de Janeiro, colonial Brazil, and the Atlantic world. If her name specifically sounds familiar to you, it might be on account of my episode, Inventing America, wherein we discussed the work in her previous book, Go-Betweens and the Colonization of Brazil, which is one of the, in my opinion, instrumental works on understanding early Brazil. Today, though, we are here to discuss her brand new book, Mapping an Atlantic World. Dr. Metcalf, Alida, if I may, thank you for taking...
Alida.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's a very hard name, but if I train people, they get it.
I really apologize. And my last, I should have asked you that you can tell I'm new at interviewing just from making that mistake right there. And especially because my last name is Wuest, Wiest. It is very difficult to pronounce. So I get that. Anyway, okay. Well, before we get started, in the show notes for this episode, I've placed 3 links. And the first of which is going to be really helpful for any of you listening out there, because it's a link to Dr. Metcalf's very easy to navigate website, which has a few of the images that you can find within her book, Mapping an Atlantic World, and would be very helpful to go along with this discussion. The second is a link where you can buy this book, because Mapping an Atlantic World would be an excellent gift for really any history nerds or map nerds, anybody, people who are into art history. Just FYI, this is an awesome book. Finally, I've included a link to her academic bio, so you can find links to her other publications if you're interested in that. Okay, well, my first question, I guess, is going to be a super easy one. What's your book about?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jesse, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. It's my first ever podcast.
Oh,
so I'm very excited about that too.
Okay, great.
My book, Mapping an Atlantic World, is the story of how the Atlantic Ocean moves from the periphery to the center on world maps. And that occurs around the year 1500. And it really represents a paradigm shift in how the world was viewed. So what I'm doing in this book is using maps as my primary sources to show how the Atlantic world comes into view and how it appears on maps.
Oh, that is awesome. Now, I probably should have told you this earlier if I didn't. The audience here ranges from people like me who are just lifelong history nerds to people who are really know what they're talking about, all the way to kids who aren't quite as knowledgeable about some of this stuff. And so some of these questions that I put down here, I just want to say to the people listening out here, if it sounds a little boring to you, I do apologize. If you already know what a TO map is, for example, my next question. But I love TO maps. I think they're really neat. And for people who don't know what a TO map is, would you tell us what that is?
Sure. So we see the TO maps most in medieval Europe. And they get the name because they're laid out in an O, which represents the oceans, and a T, which divides the continents. So if you can imagine just Europe, Africa, and Asia with a circle around it, the circle around it represents the oceans of the world, and that's the O. And then the T separates the 3 continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe. And it's represented by the Mediterranean and the Nile River and the Don River. So that's how it's just a simple little way of saying that the map is laid out as if it's a T kind of on its side inside of an O.
Oh yeah, and I should mention, by the way, if you follow along on the link on Dr. Metcalf's blog, Figure 1.1 would be the image if you wanted to take a look at that. It looks really funny. What is the purpose of that map? Because it can't possibly be to help anybody navigate.
Well, that's because in medieval Europe, the maps weren't maps in the way we think of them. They were places where knowledge was stored, but it was knowledge in a much more symbolic, metaphorical sense. So the TO map typically had Jerusalem at the center, and the Mappa Mundi from the medieval times, and Mappa Mundi just means map of the world in Latin. They essentially told the history of Christianity. And so the map was not really so much a utilitarian document to get you somewhere as a way for you to understand the history of Christianity, as it was used, like the famous Hereford Mappa Mundi in Salisbury in England. It tells the story of Christianity, and it incorporates other things as well. But it's meant to kind of be a way for priests and brothers to kind of explain things to parishioners and congregants, and they could kind of visualize the world in that way.
Oh, that's thank you for that. That's really cool. Okay, now in contrast, and if you're listening and checking out the website too, this would be figure 3.4, what I want to talk about specifically next, I guess. There are, I guess, I don't know, this would be the late medieval period. I don't know how far back these go back, these nautical maps, but in contrast, these are very detailed, I can tell, and they look very good, quote unquote, useful, a useful map to someone who is out on a boat. But, and maybe this is just that I don't really know a whole lot about maps, but just when you look at it, it looks like it's not exactly designed to be easy to be understood, even though it does have a lot of information in it. I mean, is this a secret map, or like who is using this? I mean, is this something that you could go buy in a store as a chart of the Mediterranean that would be highly detailed, or is this just something that some merchant or some prince would be hiding away, I guess, somewhere?
Well, that's a great question. And this particular chart is the oldest chart in the collection at the Library of Congress.
Oh, neat.
And this brings me to a really important point, which is the difference between a chart and a map. And my dad was a Navy man, and so I learned the difference between a chart and a map very early. Yeah. But a chart is something that sailors use, and it privileges the water. And so it typically has depths, and it's used for navigation, whereas a map is more about the land and what you find on the land. So a chart can be a map, but a map can't necessarily be a chart, if you follow.
Great, yeah.
So we're looking here at a chart. So this is a very old Mediterranean chart. It is, as you said, as you intuited, a utilitarian document, but it is hard to read if you're not kind of introduced into what charts do. But if you actually look at the map, you can kind of take it apart and understand how to read it. And here it's helpful to think in layers, like modern maps today made using digital methods in GIS. The map is constructed of layers. So this particular chart has a series of layers, and once you see them, you can read the chart more easily. So in this particular chart, there's a layer of names. There's the coastline layer. There's the layer of these lines that go across the top, okay? So the lines that go across the top are known as the rum lines, R-H-U-M-B, rum, not R-U-M like the drink. Those represent the directions of the compass, and that's what you need to match the map to how you're gonna navigate.
Yeah.
And then all of those little things that you see along the coastline, those are the names of the places. And so they're either in black ink, or if they're important places like Rome, they're in red ink. And then there's a few other things like islands, there's a scale. And so basically it's showing you the Eastern Mediterranean. You can see Italy, You can see.
Yeah, Italy is pretty prominent there.
Once you find Italy, the whole map, you see the whole chart makes sense. You see the coast.
Yeah.
So this would not have been secretive, but to get this, you had to go to a chart maker who was an artisan.
Okay.
Who had a workshop in a port city in a place like Genoa, or Naples, or Venice, or Lisbon, and you would just commission a chart. They might have one on hand, but you might have to also order it. And
Gotcha.
So merchants and sea captains would order charts.
Okay, good. Thank you for that, because I really was a little curious, and this is kind of related. It's specifically because when I was reading up and studying on Henry the Navigator, I guess, quote unquote, he really, after a while of reading some of this, I was like, this is the mafia, only in like the 1400s. What there was something. It just seemed like, and part of that, I guess, is just the what he was up to is just stealing people off of the coastline and stuff like that and selling them into slavery. But it just anyway, it really struck me as that this really was like new knowledge, I guess, a little bit. And of course, he was out in the Atlantic, I guess, or his navigators were out in the Atlantic. But I just was kind of curious about kind of how that all started a little bit.
Well, let me comment on that quickly, because that's one of the important themes in the chapter on chart makers, because basically the techniques for charting the Mediterranean, which go way back, and nobody knows how far back.
Oh, yeah.
But they're applied to the Atlantic. But the Atlantic is very different than the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, if you're a sailor, you're never that, far from the site of land. And there have been generations and generations and generations of sailors in the Mediterranean. And the same thing is sort of true for some of the Atlantic coastlines, but the Atlantic is so much bigger.
Right.
And also, when the Portuguese start sailing below the equator, you can't see the North Star anymore. And so all sorts of things have to change in order to map the Atlantic. And so the Portuguese chart makers started to create charts for the Atlantic, where they did some innovative things. So they would turn the chart so that they were longer rather than wider. If you think of the Mediterranean, it's it's long and wide. The Atlantic is long, with north on the top. It extends in a different direction, and so they accumulated knowledge on that they brought back, that were then added into charts. And so you have this gradual process of accumulating and storing information that makes its way onto charts. It's really important for opening up the Atlantic.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah. Now, one feature that I find really important on all of these charts is that I wanted to make sure we just discuss is the compass rose.
Yes, great.
Just because some of them are really just beautifully crafted. And you specifically compared to gemstones, which I thought was a really apt and just a neat metaphor. And what is the purpose of this, and why are they so beautiful? Because artists, just as a simple consequence of that, artisans are crafting them, and this is someone who's like, well, I want to make sure that I guess I'm answering my own question almost on that, but someone is just out there saying, I want to make sure some more people want to buy my map or something like that, I guess.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of scholarly discussion about this, and nobody knows for sure. But it's obvious, in my view, that the compass rose is the most important decorative element of a chart.
Yeah.
So basically, it shows the different wind directions, and the compass rose on a chart will also match the compass that's taken to sea. And so chart makers, for example, in Lisbon, also made the nautical compasses that were taken to sea. So you can kind of imagine a compass in the little box that you're carrying on your ship actually matching the rose on the chart, sort of reinforcing the connection between the two. Unfortunately, we don't have any surviving compasses from this far back.
Right.
But what the compass roses on the charts do, and you find them on the Mediterranean charts as well as on the Atlantic charts, is they're a decorative element, and they're probably also a signature of the chart maker.
Gotcha.
So they kind of stand as a sort of stamp for the workshop.
Right. Okay. Cool.
But you do have. Let me just make one more point about this.
Please.
You have very plain charts, like the chart we were talking about before, the chart from the Library of Congress of the Mediterranean,
right,
from the 1300s. So that's not a decorated chart, and nobody's interested in that chart as a work of art. The only person interested in that chart is a sailor going to sea. But you start adding compass roses, and you start adding a few cityscapes, and maybe you add a few other little details of the landscape, or maybe animals, and suddenly the chart becomes quite attractive. And so you have merchants who like to buy the charts, both to hang up in their offices or to give as gifts. And so you have really two traditions of chart making, one that's more decorative and artistic, and one that's more utilitarian and practical. And so for the historian, very few charts survive, but the charts that are more likely to survive are those that are more decorative, because they're aesthetically pleasing. They're more likely to have been saved.
Oh, wow. Okay. Now, I think one of the most important themes in the book, I guess, is that maps and these charts of the Atlantic are changing around the year 1500, obviously, as Europeans are going out to sea. One person I really want to talk, I guess, specifically about, and maybe just a little generally about maybe who some of these map makers were, other than this guy, is Juan de la Cosa, who I had never heard of until I started researching for, starting in an episode called 1492, and he just kept popping up and up and up until eventually he is killed. But from reading the sources, obviously he kept getting hired as the pilot of these expeditions, so I could tell he's very important. What I thought was really neat, and you can see this specifically, I think there's a few things on your website, but plate 4 in the section on plates is his Carta Universal, if that's in Latin, I guess, if I'm pronouncing that right, which dates to the year 1500. And I just thought it was really fascinating to really how well a visual piece of history like that can help kind of really bring the past back further into light, like a little bit for me personally. And anyway, other than, wow, Juan de la Cosa is a lot smarter than I thought he was. It's clear he plays a big role in how these maps change. And would you like to talk about that? And what is Juan de la Cosa's significance as a chart maker, I guess I should say?
Okay, great. So Juan de la Cosa, as you mentioned, was on the first expedition with Columbus, also on the second expedition. On the first expedition, he was a master of one of the ships. Which one was it? The Santa Maria, I think. Yes, and it sank. So his stock must have gone down badly.
Right. Sure. Yes.
Voyage. And on the second voyage, he identifies himself as a master chart maker, which may well have been some sort of demotion.
Right.
But we know that because Columbus is desperate to be finding the way into the Indian Ocean world and to China and to find the Great Khan. And so they're sailing along the southern coast of Cuba, and Columbus has almost reached the end, the most western point of Cuba, not quite, but he decides he's seen enough, and he makes everyone on the expedition swear, under all sorts of pains, like having their tongue cut off.
Right, yeah.
But this is the longest, widest island. No island has been longer in width than this, so therefore this must be a mainland. But Juan de la Cosa signs this, he has to, but that's where we find out that he considered himself a master chart maker. So we have this map signed by him. Some scholars believe that it was actually made by a group of people, but he does sign it, his name is on it. And it dates from the year 1500. And what's really interesting about it is as you can tell, it's just leaps out at you. It's the first map that survived, and I should say that survived because there could have been others that we don't know about, that shows the extent of the landmass in the Western Atlantic. So it really gives the sense of the two continents, the North America and South America. So I think that's why it's most significant. For me, the map from 2 years later shows this much more clearly, and that's the Carta del Cantino, which is plate 6. So it's constructed in a very similar way to Juan de la Cosa's Carta Universal, but the Carta del Cantino really shows the paradigm shift of how the Atlantic has really moved.
I'm just bringing that one up, and no, absolutely.
See that? It's really clear.
Certainly much more accurate and everything, yeah, for sure. And
this map is, we can look at this map today and understand it because this map underlies this paradigm shift that I've been talking about. So the idea that the Atlantic occupies this central space, we see this repeated on maps, for years and years afterwards. And so that's why this map is so easy for us to read. It looks familiar.
Yeah, no, it is beautiful. A lot of these, and a lot of these are just so beautiful to take a look at. Sorry, I'm getting a little lost in taking a look at that for a second. Okay. Now that I kind of brought up, the idea that somebody could just be out in the Atlantic and be, the map maker, the chart maker, you also, I can't remember what I was reading where I got this idea from exactly, but the Atlantic, obviously, the water itself needs to be drawn. And depending on the medium, you talk about that different artists are contributing to how the water gets drawn. And that leads me, I guess, to a broader point. To what extent are these maps collaborative projects? You mentioned that some people might have also been working with Juan de la Cosa, that he wasn't maybe just some Da Vinci out there in the high seas drawing this beautiful map. But anyway, would you like to talk about that, please?
Sure. So here we need to go back to the difference between a chart and, we did a chart and a map, and also a manuscript versus print.
Okay.
So if you visualize the chart maker, who's an artisan, not all that well off, kind of like artisans in early modern times.
Gotcha.
But the chart maker, and here's the important part, can make every step of the chart or the map himself, because herself, maybe there were some women chart makers, I haven't found any, but they're basically painting on parchment, on vellum, which is made from animal skin. So in the same way that the monk making an illuminated manuscript is working, so too is the chart maker. It's the same tools,
Okay.
But when you get to a printed map, it's very different, because print involves a whole slew of artisans who are not the map maker. So the cartographer, and the example that I use in my chapter on From Manuscript to Print is Martin Waldseemüller. And the Library of Congress has this phenomenal map on permanent display by Martin Waldseemüller in the Jefferson Wing that everybody should go and see when COVID's over. But this map was printed on 12 sheets of paper. So Waldseemüller could draw the sketch of the map, could provide all the information on the map, but he could not physically create it. He needed he needed these, he needed the typesetter, he needed the woodcutter, he needed the designer, somebody had to pull the pages off the press, and they were using a Gutenberg style press to make this map. And so it involved a much more complicated process to make a printed map. And so that's why the artisans start to become important, because Waldseemüller can create the idea of the map and what its geography is going to look like and what its content is going to be. But the artisans have to translate that into how that's going to be a woodblock and a printed map.
Gotcha.
And so they start to influence the aesthetics of the map. And you're point about the water is really interesting, because how are you going to represent the water? And it's the artisans that are going to start to come up with the techniques for showing what the water is going to look like. So you have lots of hands going into a printed map, which makes it distinctive from the manuscript chart, which is made in a workshop with the master chart maker, maybe working with an apprentice or with an illuminator. If it's a high-end chart, you might have an artist who can actually paint beautiful little vignettes directly on the vellum. But the printed map is a whole nother ballgame, because it requires the printer's shop to really pull it off. And Waldseemüller's map only survives in one copy. And it survives in one copy because it was bound into a book. But it's quite possible that these were then painted. So Waldseemüller's map is black and white. When you go into the Library of Congress to look at it, or if you look it up on their website, you'll see it's black and white. But it's possible, in fact, I think it's probable, that the whole thing was painted after it was printed. And so you had this enormous map that was the size of a wall that could have been attached to a wall, or it could have been mounted on a large board. So it was a massive thing.
That's really neat. You also have some examples of some globes that are being produced at this time. And so these obviously kind of have to account for the Atlantic. And who, I guess, is who is using these globes? Who is making those? I guess this is a similarly probably a collaborative project, but I thought it was pretty neat. I guess the way that the maps were drawn in and then kind of like pasted together, I guess, around a globe, if I'm getting that right.
Yes. Yes.
If you want to talk more about that, I just thought that was a neat process.
Sure. Sure. So globe making is very old. It goes back to ancient Greeks who were making globes. Globes are extremely fragile. Maps are fragile and tend to get thrown away and disappear and worn out and so forth. But globes are even more fragile. And so we have very few surviving globes. Waldseemüller created a globe at the same time that he created his world map. And although the globe doesn't survive, the globe gores do. And the globe gores, it consists of a printed sheet, as you were saying, that you would cut out and then paste over a ball. So you have to imagine a kind of a papier-mâché sort of ball that then they would cut out and then paste the globe gores around, and then they would paint it. And in the new material on my website, we have reconstructed a Waldseemüller's globe as a digital model. And you can actually see what it looks like. You can see it spin.
Oh, cool.
That's really cool. But unfortunately, the globe itself doesn't exist. But this also would have been painted. So the first step was printing the sheet. And then I don't know when they would have painted it, whether before they cut it out or after, but eventually it goes over the ball, and it was a very attractive little thing that you could buy. So you could hold the globe in your hand and then look at the huge wall map that he made. So it was an astonishing production.
That's really cool. I keep meaning to say in between your answers that I want to apologize if I call a chart a map a chart. I could very well call it.
I do it all the time.
And just to anybody listening too, though. I'm sure I'm making a bunch of mistakes.
As long as you understand that there's a difference in the usage of a chart.
Yes. No, that was excellent. No, I thank you very much. That was really helpful for me. There's a lot of birds, and specifically parrots, on the Portuguese maps of Brazil and Africa. And obviously, I think at one level it's kind of easy to see why. It's because there are a lot of birds that live in parts in Brazil and Africa, but there's a lot of birds that live everywhere. Why are people using birds specifically as symbol? Is this like somebody used one and then other people are copying that idea, just saying like, oh, that's a great symbol, or what's up with the birds?
Great question. No, a great question. And the birds first got me interested in this whole project because
Oh,
they
wow.
were so beautiful. So first of all, parrots are not native to Europe.
Okay.
And all the parrots that are in Europe have been introduced through trade.
Gotcha.
So there had been, trade, back in Greek and Roman times when parrots were brought in from places like India. But by the time by 1500, by the years immediately before 1500, there weren't any parrots in Europe. But when these voyages start returning from Africa and from India, these exotic birds start getting reintroduced.
Right.
And so when Brazil is discovered in 1500, the accounts that we have, which there's only 3 of them that describe the landing in 1500, but they all mention these birds that are very large. And so those are the scarlet macaws that are actually painted on the Contino world chart. And it's probable, I think it's highly likely, that they were painted from real birds that had been brought back from Brazil.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And Columbus's logs are filled with descriptions of parrots as well. So, the Spaniards and the Portuguese and the French, when they arrived in the Americas, they were just shocked at how green it was and how many birds there were. And then, so those were the first images that were used to describe the Americas, was how green it was. And these enormous flocks of parrots all over the Caribbean, Brazil. I mean, you can imagine how beautiful it was to their eyes, especially coming from Spain or Portugal, which are pretty dry climates. So the birds start to represent specific places. And on the Carta del Contino, the 1502 world map that we talked about a minute ago, there are 3 different parrots on that map. There's a certain kind of parrot for Brazil, that's the scarlet macaw. There's the African gray parrot, which is a parrot that's well known to parrot enthusiasts. And there's the Senegalese parrot. And so the Senegalese parrot appears in West Africa. The African gray appears farther south in its natural habitat. And the scarlet macaws appear in Brazil.
Oh, that's really cool. Now, I want to stay on, I guess, on another image that's in the maps of Brazil, I guess, that show there's also a lot of images of human sacrifice there. And nowadays, and I guess if you're looking at this here in 2020, they don't appear quite as gruesome to us, but I would want to remind anyone who is listening that in the 16th century, you probably didn't get to see a whole lot of brand new images all the time anyway like that. And something like that might have been just quite, I don't know if something like that would have been almost kind of scandalous to some and horrifying to some of the people who would have, if you're, I'm trying to envision someone back in Germany or Italy who just is saying like, oh, so what's going on here? Oh, Brazil, what? I guess, what does this mean? Would you like to get into what this does to Europe as far as how they perceive Brazil?
Yes, well, that's a really important question and one of the huge takeaways, I think, because as we were just talking about the birds, early images that are placed on maps about the Americas are the color green, like on the Juan de la Cosa map that we talked about, where the Americas are all this deep green. The birds appear in Brazil. But later, the more striking image is the cannibalist image, and it takes off and gets repeated on map after map after map. And this is one of the things that happens with maps, is that chart makers and map makers copy each other, and so they copy images, and certain images start to stick. And cannibalism is one of the images that starts to stick. And this was a very difficult chapter to write, and I must have rewritten this chapter 3 times, the chapter on cannibalism, because as you're suggesting, it makes a huge difference that this becomes one of the defining images of the Americas, that it is the land of the cannibals, because it justifies all kinds of things. It justifies enslaving indigenous people. It justifies wars. It justifies conquest. And so the more that image gets established and copied, the more it cements this kind of European idea of, oh, well, we can go and conquer these lands because the people living there deserve it. You know, they're barbaric. And so it's a very damning image that gets associated with the Americas. And because of the way imagery gets copied from map to map, it repeats itself over and over again, especially on printed maps. So the first printed map that has this image of cannibalism is 1516. It's Waldseemüller's second map. So he does his first map in world map in 1507, and the second world map in 1516. And on the Carta Marina, there is this image of cannibalism over Brazil. And that map, because it's a printed map, it has many more viewers. You know, a manuscript chart or a manuscript chart of the world is going to have relatively few viewers. But once you have a printed map, you know, in 1,000 copies, many people, more people are going to see it. And printers start to recognize that they can make money off of maps. And so they start to reprint maps and reprint editions of maps, changing just a few things. And so the image of the cannibal gets reproduced over and over and over again. And so it becomes a common way of seeing the Americas. And it's a very negative and destructive image that gets stamped onto the Americas. And here's also part of what maps do. Maps proclaim truths. If you go here, this is what you will find. You know, so the map is saying, if you go to the Americas, this is what you will find. And so it sort of kind of starts to just pre-structure what people are going to expect to find.
Yeah. That's that's a very good point. Okay, well, folks, I think that's all the questions that I've got regarding mapping in Atlantic world. Alida, I'm getting that right?
Alida, yes, perfect.
But before I let you go, I have one last question for you.
Sure.
I've got an episode that I'm working on. I'm gonna release it. Hopefully, if I get all my editing done tonight, tonight, so it's out on El Dia de los Muertos on the fall of the Mexica. And I've noticed a lot of the books written about the conquest of Mexico conclude with who was responsible, and all of them. Even Prescott, who cannot stand giving credit to American indigenous people, I don't think, give varying degrees of credit to the interpreters, and specifically to a woman, Marina or Lama Alinche. I'm not, like Montezuma or whatever his name is. I'm not 100% sure I don't know what the correct name would be, but they all say that she's like kind of a critical piece to the puzzle. And I don't think she gets enough credit. So just on the eve, I guess, of me releasing my episode, I think you're the perfect person to ask this question. How much credit should interpreters like Marina, for example, get for the conquest of the Americas? If we were gonna like Hugh Thomas say at the end, this is all Cortez is the critical piece. Well, how, to what credit, I guess, do interpreters deserve to this, I guess, the recipe of conquest of the Americas, I guess?
Oh, well, that's a great question. And Lama Linche is, I think, a huge advantage that Cortez has in the conquest of Mexico. But I think you have to think of it in terms of stages. So the conquest of Mexico begins from Cuba. when Cortez is leaving Cuba with a small group of men without proper authority from the governor of Cuba. And they arrive on the Yucatan Peninsula near where present-day Isla Mujeres is. And it's a Mayan region. And they pick up 2 interpreters who are Spaniards who speak Mayan. So they can now negotiate between Spanish and Mayan, okay? They pick up Dona Marina, as she's later called, farther up on the Tabasco coast, and she speaks Mayan and Nahuatl. And so she becomes essential for being able to interpret with the Mexica. So she speaks the language of Tenochtitlan, and she can speak Mayan. So you have this interpretation going where, using the 2 Spanish men who could speak Mayan, Jeronimo de Aguilar, and I'm not sure the other one's name, you sort of have the stage translation of, you go from Spanish to Mayan, from Mayan to Nahuatl, and then back again. But if you look at some of the accounts of the conquest of Mexico that are written from the Mexica point of view or the Aztec point of view, you can see that she's often positioned between Cortez and Montezuma. And sometimes when they would be addressing Cortez, they would, kind of address Malinche as if she was kind of like Cortez, because she was the mouthpiece. So she's very important in facilitating the Spanish entrance to Tenochtitlan. And once they're in Tenochtitlan, she's very influential, because Cortez is trying to take Tenochtitlan, which is a more magnificent city than any of them have ever seen, without destroying the city. And so as long as there's a negotiated sort of contact going on, she's super important. That all changes though when on the famous night of La Noche Triste, when the Spaniards have to withdraw from Tenochtitlan, and Dona Marina escapes along with Cortez and others. But following La Noche Triste, that's when smallpox arrives in Tenochtitlan.
Right.
And so, so she's important in this early phase, but disease plays a huge role in decimating the population of Tenochtitlan, because smallpox it's a little bit like COVID, spread through the air. But unlike COVID, 30% of people who get exposed to smallpox, get sick, and it's got a very or die. It's got a very high mortality rate. And then the final fall of Tenochtitlan is a military battle where the Spanish are advancing in on the causeways. It's described by many chroniclers. So Malinche is not important there. So I think if you think of it in terms of stages, you can see how she's really significant in the beginning, and then she's going to become significant later on after the fall, because they're going to go back to this kind of negotiated ways to try and establish their power.
Awesome.
Because they have to try and rule over the defeated peoples in the city. So she'll become important post fall of the city.
Yeah. I found she's very. I just found she's very important, and obviously I think obviously both Spanish and Mexican society were just so sexist. It was hard. It's almost like sometimes I wonder if, for example, like Cortez is very good at getting allies, and I wonder how much of that is she responsible for the way she translates? Possibly. I don't know if we would ever know the answer, but there's times where all the people who would be enemies of the emperor, they all hear about. I think about how great the Spanish are and how this alliance is going to work out, and I wonder if maybe it's possible if stuff like that is going on, because she wasn't born a Maya. She was sent there, I guess, at some point, and I just wonder if if she may have had a grudge. I guess there was one point in the sources where she taught. I mean, she just goes out of her way. I guess she's up on a rooftop or a temple or a pyramid, something, and she's yelling at the Mexica, like, "You fool, like you should feed the Spaniards," or whatever she's saying. They make it a point that she's, I guess, berating them, almost like, and it just made me, I guess I start thinking about, she's certainly not a neutral observer, I guess, of the conquest.
Yeah, that comes along with the territory of being a go-between. So go-betweens are figures that are often very vulnerable.
Right.
And they always take a side. And so she chose the Spanish side. And if you go back and read Bernal Diaz, it seems as though she was born of a noble family in Simpoala. And so she was educated as a young girl. And so that's part of why she becomes so important, not only just because she speaks Nahuatl, but she, she's got the kind of class status, not that she has status, but she knows the language, she knows kind of the higher status language that's going to appeal to the nobles and the kings that Cortez is going to come into contact with, in a way that Jeronimo de Aguilar, this poor Spaniard who's been living as a slave among the Maya, can't possibly do that.
Gotcha.
And also I think too, loyalty, we think about loyalty in different ways as modern people do. And in the past, who you give your loyalty to was probably based on other kinds of calculations than we use. And so, she chose her loyalty to Cortez.
Well, and I mean, as terrible as the Spanish were, I mean, the Mexican do not come across as sympathetic in some way. And I mean, I guess during the final days of the conquest, actually, they do come across to me as a little sympathetic when they're holed up and they refuse to surrender. And you're just, but there's so many other peoples in Mexico who are like, oh yeah, great. I've been waiting to teach them a lesson that, it's kind of a live by the sword, die by the sword kind of situation. Not that to excuse what the Spanish are doing. Okay, well, that's all for me today, folks. I don't want to waste too much of your time, Alida, and thank you for chatting with us. It was delightful to meet you. Folks, the holiday season is upon us, even in the Corona time, it's true. Once again, the book is Mapping an Atlantic World. You can find a link to that in the show notes. It would make an excellent gift, in my humble opinion. There's also links to Dr. Metcalf's blog, so you can check out some of the other stuff she's written. All right. Thanks for tuning in. And one last thing before we go, in case you didn't know, this podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Network. Big Heads Media is sort of like the Netflix of podcasts. What they do is penetrate the deep, dark forest of the internet, find the best podcasts, hew them down, bring forth the finest of timbers for people who enjoy podcasts. Needless to say, that means we are part of an awesome lineup of history shows like Her American Story, for example. This show is pure mahogany. It's about the stories of first and generation American women. Here's a promo for that show.
Do you love a good story? Her American Story is a podcast for anyone who loves a good story. First and second generation American women share their American experience. Sharing our stories helps us to relate to one another, build understanding, as well as provide representation for those that need it most. I grew up in a smaller American town and lacked representation in my community and simply in media at that time. I created something I wanted to hear. I hope this podcast reaches those that need it most, as well as serves as a collection of simply interesting stories. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at HerAMStory. Everyone has a story. Share yours with me. Email me at heramericanstory@gmail.com.
orders from the madman in command. So let's drop him on an island and leave him in the sand, 'cause it's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship. Shit. Haven't you heard what's happening here? You're no longer in control, and we're drinking up your beer. This is now a democratic, egalitarian pirate ship, so enjoy your trip. 'Cause it's a mutiny. It's a mutiny.